All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Genesis. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 18, verse 16, down through chapter 19, all the way to the end of that chapter in verse 38. And as always, we need to make sure we keep the context in mind. And so if you recall chapters 16, 17, and the first part of 18, God has just met with Abram and has reaffirmed the promise once again to them. In fact, he was even more specific this time in this meeting than he had been previously. And specifically, what he made clear was the line of promise won't merely come from Abraham's body, as had been said in Genesis 15, but it's going to come through Sarah. And in fact, God changed Abram and Sarai's names to Abraham and Sarah in this moment and gave a specific sign of his covenant with Abraham and Sarah, and that sign was circumcision. So, indeed, God's going to take care of Ishmael and care for Hagar, bless them, because he wants to for the sake of Abraham. He said he would do that. So he's going to care for Ishmael and Hagar, but that's not the line of promise. The line of promise is going to come not just from Abraham, but from Abraham through Sarah. And so this scene in chapter 18, verse 16 and following picks up right at the tail end of that meeting. God had appeared to Abraham and Sarah in a human form, along with two angels. Now, those three who visited Abraham and Sarah are moving on. So, verse 16 of chapter 18 picks up at that point and says, "Then the men rose from there and looked down toward Sodom." So they're up on the heights of the land of Canaan, and they can see down into the valley around the Dead Sea, and they're looking down onto the city of Sodom, which is the region where Abraham's nephew Lot has moved. And so they're looking down in that region, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. And then we get this interesting little interchange in verses 17 and following, where the Lord really has sort of almost a conversation with himself about should he bring Abraham in on what he's thinking of doing as he's looking down towards Sodom. So verse 17 says, "The Lord said, 'Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham will certainly become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed?'" Notice the rationale for this, as God is wrestling with, looking at Sodom, knowing what he plans to do to Sodom. He's wrestling with, should I bring Abraham into this? Because Abraham is going to be a mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through him. And then God continues this little conversation with himself, "For I've chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken to him." And so what we see here in verses 17 through 19 is that the Lord is deciding to share what he's going to do to Sodom with Abraham. And he's going to decide to do that specifically because of the promise that he made to Abraham. And that promise means that Abraham ought to be brought into the Lord's purposes and plans. Why? Well, because Abraham needs to learn God's ways so that he can embody God's ways and pass on God's ways to his family after him. This is an important part of Abraham's role in being a blessing to all the nations. He's got to understand God's righteousness and justice if he's going to pass on God's righteousness and justice to his household, so that through that means he can be a blessing to the whole earth. And so the Lord decides to bring Abraham into what he's going to do to Sodom as a means of helping Abraham learn about the Lord's ways. And so, verse 20, the Lord said, "The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great. Their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see whether they have done entirely as the outcry which has come to me indicates. If not, I will know." And so God, in verse 20, tells Abraham, look what's as I'm looking at Sodom and Gomorrah, here's what you need to understand. Their outcry has reached my ears, and I'm going to go investigate the matter to see what needs to be done. And the idea of outcry, that word is frequently used in the Old Testament for a cry of the oppressed, a cry of those who are being oppressed and they're longing for somebody to make it right. And God said he's heard that. And so all of the sin that's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah part of that is this oppression of the weak and the vulnerable and the helpless. God has heard their cry for somebody to make it right. And so God has let Abraham know that. And then the men, specifically the two angels with the Lord, that's what is meant by the men in verse 22, turn away from there. They head down toward Sodom, and Abraham's left standing there before the Lord. And so the Lord remains behind with Abram, and they're going to have a conversation about this as the Lord is helping teach and train his ways to Abraham. And so then we get this well-known snapshot of Abraham negotiating with the Lord for the city of Sodom. And so verse 23, Abraham approached the Lord and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous people within the city. Will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justly?" So Abraham raises this question, and you can hear the repetition of righteousness and wicked, and it culminates in this rhetorical question, shouldn't the judge of all the earth do justly? And so as Abraham is discussing this with the Lord, he's beginning to understand that God is the judge of all the earth, and that he can't treat the wicked and the righteous the same. He's got to do justice. So the Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people within the city, I'll spare the entire place on their account." So Abraham replied, "Now, behold, I ventured to speak to the Lord, although I am only dust and ashes. Suppose the 50 righteous are lacking 5. Will you destroy the entire city because of 5? And the Lord said, "I will not destroy it because of if I find 45 people there." So Abram spoke to him again and said, "What if 40 are found there?" And he said, I won't do it on account of 40. And then Abram said, "Oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak. Suppose 30 are found there." And he said, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." And he said, "Now behold, I venture to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are there." And the Lord said, "I will not destroy it on account of the 20. Then he said, "Oh, may the Lord not be angry, and I shall speak only one more time. Suppose 10 are found there." And the Lord said, "I will not destroy it on account of the 10. Now, this little scene has sometimes been pictured or described as like haggling or bartering in a Middle Eastern bazaar. Common experience, common cultural background. But notice, read this closely, and that's not quite right. This is actually reverse haggling or reverse bartering. In a Middle Eastern bazaar, just like in maybe a garage sale or you're buying something off a marketplace, right? In that kind of bartering, you start low and you work up until there's an amount agreed upon by the seller and the buyer. And so you always start low and work up. But Abraham doesn't do that. Abraham starts high and works low. It's reverse haggling. It's reverse bartering. And seeing that is actually crucial to understanding what's going on in this snapshot. What's going on here is Abraham is learning the ways of the Lord, and what he learns is that the Lord is far more merciful than he first thought. Would he spare it for 50? Indeed he would. What about 40? Indeed he would. All the way down to 10. He'll even spare this wicked city for just 10 righteous people. The Lord is way more merciful than Abraham realized and thought. And so as soon as the Lord had finished speaking to Abraham, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned back to his own home, his own tent. And then what we get in chapter 19 is the well-known story of God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. So the Lord and Abraham have had this conversation. Abraham has realized God is more merciful than he even thought. God will spare the city of Sodom if there's just 10 righteous people there. And so God's emissaries, those two angels now, go to Sodom, and Genesis chapter 19 tells us what happened in the city of Sodom. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. It's fairly familiar to us. I just want to point out a few things as we read down through it. We have to remember that this story began in chapter 15, where God has heard the outcry of this city. So part of what's going on in Sodom is oppression of the weak, the vulnerable, and the needy and the marginalized. We see in chapter 19 in what happens that part of the way this city expresses itself is in violent, immoral, sexual immoral behavior. Across the board, all different people, from the old to the young, is what chapter 19 tells us. And we learn from the rest of the Old Testament after this moment, when Sodom is brought up, it's brought up almost as like a paradigm, a model of the wicked city. And so as Chris Wright puts it, one of my favorite Old Testament commentators and scholars is Christopher Wright. He puts it this way. He says that Sodom represents the way of the fallen world. It stands in Scripture as a proverbial prototype of human wickedness and of the judgment of God that ultimately falls upon evildoers. That's what happens from this story. It's told here, and then as the rest of the Scriptures hearken back to this moment, it stands as this proverbial prototype of fallen human wickedness. And so the two angels arrive at the city of Sodom. Lot is sitting in the city gate, which is the place where leaders and men of the city would gather and meet and take care of business and render judgments and all that. And so as they come into the city, Lot sees them and meets them and offers them hospitality. And so he welcomes them into his home. Middle Eastern hospitality is a huge deal. And so now he's welcomed them in. They said, no, we'll just spend the night in the public square. And he strongly urges them, no, don't do that. That's not safe for you. That's not good. You need to come into my house. So they agreed. They came into Lot's house. He made a meal for them. And they were going to stay at Lot's house that night. Now, before they all lay down for bed that night, the men of the city, chapter 19 tells us, surrounded Lot's house, both young and old, and demanded that Lot send the men outside so they could, not to be crass, but essentially so they could kind of gang rape these two angels, because they thought they were just men who visited their city. This tells us how wicked and immoral and violent the city of Sodom was. Lot refused. There's this moment where Lot's standing outside trying to get the people from the city to disband. It's getting violent. They're about ready to do Lot himself in when the men, the angels, crack open the door, reach for the door, pull Lot inside. They lock the door. And then those two angels begin to warn Lot of what's going to happen. And so they say this to Lot, 19:12. The two men said to Lot, "Whom else do you have here? A son-in-law and your sons and daughters and whoever you have in the city, bring them out of that place, for we're about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." And so once again, we get that restatement of this outcry, this cry for justice from oppression and from the violence and the wickedness of the city. And so they warn Lot, gather your family together, get out of the city, we're going to destroy it. Lot goes out. He tells his sons-in-law who were about to marry his daughter. So they've been formally engaged, betrothed to his daughters, and they're about to marry his daughters. He goes out and tells them, we got to get out of the city. God's going to destroy it. They laughed at Lot and thought he was joking and didn't believe him. And so they wouldn't come. So when morning dawns, the angels urged Lot, get out, take your wife, your 2 daughters who are with you then, or you're going to be swept away in the punishment of the city. And Lot hesitates. The angels then are like, grabbed Lot by the hand of his wife, the hands of his 2 daughters, and basically dragged them out of the city because the compassion of the Lord was upon him, it says. So they brought them out and put them out of the city. And they tell them to run up into the mountains. Lot's like, look, I'm too old and too slow, can't make it to the mountains. There's a town nearby. Can I just go to that town? The angel said, fine, go to that town. And that town's name is Zoar. And so they head to Zoar. And the Lord rains brimstone and fire, verse 24, on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the surrounding area and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground, completely devastated the region. And as they're fleeing from those cities, as is well known, verse 26, Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. And we need to make sure when we hear that, we're not just thinking a glance back. The idea seems to be that she really wanted to go back. That was her home. She loved it. She didn't despise that city. And so her looking back is a longing to go back. And she becomes a pillar of salt as part of the destruction of those cities. And then the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah ends this way. Now, Abraham got up early in the morning. He went to the place where he'd stood before the Lord, where he could look down into the valley, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the surrounding area, and behold, he saw the smoke of the land ascending like the smoke of a furnace. It was completely devastated and burning, and so it came about when God destroyed the cities of the surrounding area that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the destruction when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. In other words, God spared Lot's life because of Abraham. And then the chapter actually ends with a bit of an odd snapshot. Lot's daughters, who lost their soon-to-be husbands, who refused to leave Sodom, the entire region that they had been living in is completely devastated and destroyed. All the people have been killed. And so they don't think there's any possibility of them ever getting married in the future. So they choose to preserve their family line in a dishonorable way. Their dad is the only man left. He's old. They have no money for a bride price. And so what they choose to do is get their dad, Lot, drunk and sleep with him and preserve their family line that way. That's the odd way that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah ends. And the very last couple lines of the chapter 19, indicates that the offspring from this dishonorable act by the daughters leads to 2 of the tribal peoples that Israel is going to deal with both during the Exodus, when these books are being written, and for the rest of their history. And so verse 37 of chapter 19 says, the firstborn, that is the oldest daughter of Lot, gave birth to a son and named him Moab. He's the father of the Moabites to this day. And so the tribe of Moab comes from a dishonorable union between Lot's daughter and Lot himself. And then verse 38 says, and as for the younger, she gave birth to a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. And so the same sort of thing there. And so what we see is that while Lot and his daughters have fled Sodom, Sodom still remains in the heart of his daughters. I think that's part of the point of this section and this little snapshot, is to show us that immorality is still present in their heart. Now, as we wrap up this really tragic snapshot, just a couple of things by way of theological reflection. The first is mercy and justice. Abraham learns the ways of the Lord, that the Lord is incredibly merciful, but he's also just. And he's willing to suspend his justice for just 10 people. Sadly, the city of Sodom was so violent, so wicked, so idolatrous, so corrupt and evil. There wasn't even 10 righteous persons to save the city. And so Abraham learns through this account the ways of the Lord, his justice and his righteousness and his mercy. The second theological reflection closely related to that here is just the whole theme of corruption. That because Sodom sort of becomes this proverbial prototypical city of human wickedness, it reminds us that the world is desperately in need of the promised blessing, that sin has so corrupted the heart of mankind that the promise to Abraham is desperate. Like, the world is so corrupt, God's blessing needs to come to this world. And so we come back to the promise of Abraham, that through his seed, all the nations will be blessed. Again, not through all his seed, only through the line of promise. And ultimately, that promise culminates in Jesus the Messiah, who is bringing his salvation, God's righteousness and justice, now to the world as it is. And may we, like Abraham, may we continue to learn the ways of the Lord, his righteousness and justice, that we might embody it in our time and place and pass it on to the best of our ability to our children and our grandchildren and our families and our household, because the nations desperately need to know the righteousness and justice of the Lord. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. To each and every one of you who give, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. If you want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page, through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. And you can set up a one-time gift right there by putting a dollar amount in, or you can make it monthly by clicking the little box that says Make This Monthly. Thanks a ton for your support.